Some people would say that Sarah Jessica Parker has been almost single-handedly responsible for giving this great city a new lease of life. She oozed chic and shock and sex appeal. And now she's got a new film out. I don't know how she does it. And, well, we don't know how she does it. Let's find out.
Sorry, I'm going to silence this thing. Yeah.
Everything okay?
Yep. I think you'll see that I've targeted a few industries where I really see the dividends multiplying.
Yeah. The rub is, Harcourt hates the retirement business, so what could we do to convince him?
What is the matter with you? I think you placed something in my mouth.
I have lice.
You have
Lice! Oh my God. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I just kept picturing little tiny bugs repelling off my hair into his inbox.
Oh my God. I'm going to vomit.
Sarah, it's so great to have you with us. I've got one of my favorite quotes that I read was this marvelous one about your son and so on, James, who's 8, isn't he?
Correct,
Yes.
James Wilkie.
James doesn't like me using words he thinks I'm too old to use, and I'm not allowed to dance in front of anyone. What sort of words are too old to use?
I think he associates vernacular that is, he thinks more appropriate for anybody under the age of, say, 25, that I shouldn't be using it. Things like words like cool, dude, awesome.
Oh, yes, yes.
Wow. The sort of expletives that this generation uses.
That's right.
Or the word like, which I would prefer him not to use.
Right. But yes, but that's right, because yes, our boys or young men, they always, words like fit is
Fit.
one of the wicked.
Yes,
and
yes,
so,
yes. James Wilkie
they're
uses
their
wicked.
words, and they're not really.
They're not our words.
Convincing if we use them.
And I think it's developmentally pretty correct that he is starting to be embarrassed of me, by me, around me, near me. But
4 pronouns in 2 seconds. Very
yes.
good going.
He doesn't mind pronouns. But there's this other side of him that he will not let his peer group see, which is that he's incredibly cozy, very clingy, very sweet, very attached. But it's everything I heard about the maturation process, that eventually they just they force you to drop them off 10 or so blocks from their school. And
a chauffeur-driven car too is something they don't
chauffeur-driven car.
don't want to be taken to school in.
Well, that won't happen
dropped
in our
off round the
house.
corner.
Not a problem in our house.
How old were you when you knew you wanted to be an actress? I mean, you were acting when you were 8 and so on, weren't you? But before that, you saw Claire Bloom. How old were you when you saw Claire Bloom?
Well, by the time I was working and watching Claire Bloom, I was 11, and I had started to work around 8, and the very age my son is right now. And I think what happened is I grew up, I'm one of 8 children. I grew up in a family that loved the arts. It was a huge part of our growing up life, the theater and the ballet and the symphony. And actually, ironically, television was not part of our life until later. But when I got my first job, it was just a funny thing. I read an ad in the paper that they were looking for a young girl to play the little match girl in the Hans Christian Andersen story. And I stood in line with, 1,000 or so other girls. And I, very fortunately, I got the part. And I had this really sort of magical 5-day shoot experience. And I loved this exercise of pretending to be somebody else, not surprising in a family of 8 that you would want to escape your own self. And I think that's really that, in combination with going to the ballet, going to the theater so much and being transported by those experiences, doing it myself, I thought I would very much like to do this. Now, this wasn't like an intellectual thought, this was an emotional experience. And by the time I was 11, when I auditioned to play Flora in The Innocents opposite Claire Bloom, then I started to really understand the discipline and a work ethic that's required, and the kind of commitment it takes, and the sacrifice, and the years and years of hard work. And and I was not in any way dissuaded.
Were you dissuaded off something else? Were you ever tempted to be a baseball player, I mean, or whatever?
I think by the time I was nearing the end of high school, I had been working by that point for about 10 years, and really there was nothing else in my sights. I loved being a ballet dancer. By that point had been sort of forced to choose between ballet and the theater, very valid concern on my teacher's part that you can't do both. Ballet requires enormous amount of hours, and I think I had decided at that point I would rather be Ruth Gordon and keep working my whole life. I was too selfish to be a teacher. Yeah. And there was really nothing else. Now as a grown-up person, I see all sorts of other things that are really, really interesting to me, but I don't have the education to pursue them. So I just do it as a kind of, I have lots of curiosity about the world, let's put it that way.
But once you'd made the decision, you were happy with it, really?
Very, and I continue to be, and not only happy, but I think enormously grateful that I was raised at a time in the theater where I could really pursue the work, and there wasn't the sort of culture that exists around young actors, and certainly not the kind of pressure that exists around people in the public eye. It's a very different emphasis on the attention that's paid to actors today, and also that I was raised and surrounded and really kind of apprenticed with really, really gifted actors who were only concerned with the work.
Well, I was going to say, that's very interesting, because I was saying, who were, after Claire Bloom, who were the people you worked with or saw who influenced you, not necessarily deliberately?
I would say dozens and dozens of names, some of whom are still today not known outside the small territory of the New York theater community. Some people like the great actress Mary McDonald, who I worked with, great directors and playwrights, and mostly journeyman actors whose name you probably wouldn't be familiar with, nor would your audience, but people who were devoting their lives and traveling around like gypsies from regional theater to regional theater and small off-Broadway plays, and that was the work that I wanted to do. I didn't think at all about money or somebody having an impression of me outside of my own peers and critics of the New York Times. And that was really what I was most impressed by, the thing that mattered most to me.
Because in fact, mentioning money, I mean, in fact, people often forget, for a lot of actors, it's a very tough and poverty-stricken life, isn't it, if you don't make it?
I think like a lot of pursuits in the arts, it's not a really money-making venture. If you're able to support yourself, that's just an incredible thing and good fortune that happens if you can support yourself as an actor or as an artist, as a ballet dancer, as a painter, a musician. But really, I think the period in which I sort of came up, it was just because you loved the work and you were challenged by the work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, very nice.
English gallantry.
Very lovely. Thanks. Thank you.
The big issue, though, this week, of course, has been here in New York, Palestine and Israel. And the tempo of the movement towards dramatic change seems to be slowing. Today, Thursday, the day before the big debates and so on, seems to be slowing a bit. But let's check with two people who've been at the center of it all through the haggling that's gone on so far. Will the haggling lead to anything? Mark Regev for Israel on one hand, Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator for the Palestinians on the other side. Let's hear them both.
We're not coming to the UN as a Palestinian strategy.
Right.
We're not submitting an application for the Security Council for admittance as a strategy. This is part of the Palestinian strategy. I was born as a Palestinian for one purpose, that is to restore Palestine back to the geographic map. Today, we have a government in Israel that installed itself as a source of authority, that deprived us from our jurisdiction in the legal domain, economic domain, security sphere, and Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, believes he can do it for another century. He has no responsibilities as an occupying power. He continues with settlements, he continues his occupation, and we have to do his responsibilities. He the message to him today, and to the Americans for that matter, this is not sustainable. The status quo cannot be maintained.
What will happen to the status quo if nothing is done?
Well, if we get a veto from the United States, and nations have choices, if the Congress decide to cut our aid, if the Israelis decided to freeze our tax revenues, if Bibi Netanyahu continues with the settlement activities, we will ask him to prepare himself to shoulder the responsibilities of Israel as an occupying power from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean. If he wants to call my hometown Jericho, Yericho, its biblical name, if he wants to call Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, and if he wants to refer to me as Mar, Saeb Erekat, Mar in Hebrew means mister, he's welcome. But I dare him to close his eyes and walk me through the year 2025, not far away from today. What does he see from my hometown Jericho to the Mediterranean?
But what, in that circumstance, would have happened by 2025?
I said even those children who are born in non-Jewish households in September 2011, when they enter the first grade in 2017, they'll be the majority between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. They know that. Israelis are not doing me a favor when they sit with me in order to achieve the two-state solution. Establishing a Palestinian state, yes, is a major Palestinian interest, but it's a cardinal Israeli interest. And for the US, I heard President Obama speak yesterday about freedom in Egypt, in Syria, and Libya, and we shared that with him. But if they're going to continue treating Israel as a country above the laws of man, if they're going to continue with the petty politics of tolerating Israel's settlements and occupation, I think bin Laden will rise from his grave.
And so what do you think will be the future of this part of the world, this absolute pit of despair and hatred at the moment?
Well, look, I think we have an opportunity. I think what's happening on the Arab streets today is the most important development in the last 1,000 years. People are taking to the streets not to improve their life conditions, not to have jobs or bread. Arabs are saying we want to see with our eyes, hear with our ears, speak with our tongues, and they deserve this. There are two things required to salvage this region from the hands of extremists. One, drying the swamp of the Israeli occupation, establishing a Palestinian state to live side by side the state of Israel in 6-7 lines. And secondly, democracy in the Arab world. Anyone who says Arabs are not ready for democracy is a racist. We are sick and tired as Arabs to see Western policymakers hug Saddam Hussein and treat him as a good dictator when he ventures in a crazy war against Iran, and then turn him into a bad dictator when he occupies Kuwait. And then I think Gaddafi was being treated like Mother Teresa a few months ago because of the investments, and now he's turned into the evil on earth.
And so in that situation, what happens next? I mean, what could happen next to improve things?
You know,
if tomorrow does not produce a solution, which is obviously unlikely.
Tomorrow is not going to produce a solution. No. Tomorrow, the 23rd of September 2011, will be the beginning and not the end. The road ahead of us is going to be a long one. But the point is, where do we go from 23rd of September 2011? Some people want to take us the business as usual. Negotiations for the sake of negotiations, beating around the bush, and what we're telling them, it's over. This cannot happen. We want to negotiate. We know that the establishment of a state requires negotiations, but we want to hear Mr. Netanyahu standing up here and say, I accept two states on 1967, and that I will stop settlements. Short of that, he's not a partner. He is not a partner. And we cannot continue business as usual. He has a choice to make. He may employ the elements of public relations as a strategy, as a policy, as maneuvers, as tactics. That's his choice, but that will not make peace. And we were not going to be engaged with him in finger-pointing, blame game, and scoring points. This does not save lives of Israelis or Palestinians.
And so you have a situation really where, in a sense, thinking back to the fact that I always felt that as Prime Minister General Rabin could have made peace between the two sides then, because he had the trust of the right wing as well as the rest and so on. I mean, are you in fact waiting for a new figure to emerge, rather than that it can't be Netanyahu because of his convictions, that you have to wait for a more favourable Israeli leader before you can get anywhere?
To be honest, I respect the democratic choice of Israelis.
Yeah.
They choose, they elect as much as we choose and elect. But Israelis should know, they should have leaders who tell them that if we want to make peace with Palestinians, we need to withdraw to the 67 borders. And what they need are tough negotiators. You mentioned Rabin. I sat with this gentleman. He viewed Israel 100 years from that day. And you sit with certain Israeli prime ministers and they care about the 9 o'clock news tonight. So there is a difference between being a tough negotiator, representing your interests, and that's the right way to do things, and being a non-negotiator, just to blame the others. This cycle, this vicious cycle of negotiations for the sake of negotiations will not continue anymore. So from the 23rd of September, it's up to President Obama, it's up to Prime Minister Cameron, President Sarkozy. They have the choice. They can continue treating Israel as a country above the laws of man and tolerate it for the petty politics of whatever they say, or they can focus on the bigger picture. Because statesmen in 2011, when they see the streets of Egypt, the streets of Syria, the streets of Libya, Yemen, and so on, they should ask themselves one question. What can we do to make the right people win? And by right people, I mean democracy, human rights, women's rights, stability, moderation. And you do this by not tolerating Israeli occupation and settlement policies. You do this by not speaking about freedom in Libya and fighting even wars in Libya or in Syria or in anywhere in the Arab world. And when it comes to Palestinian freedom, you become deaf, you become speechless, and you become blind.
We are in New York. The Palestinian president is in New York. My Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, has proposed that we meet and restart the peace process. There's common sense behind that argument. There's logic behind that position. The only way to solve the issues is through talking. Let's talk.
That absolutely makes sense, except for the problem that when they've got together to talk before, it has failed so profoundly, and the Palestinians would say that it's more Netanyahu's fault than theirs. But I mean, unfortunately, there's no track record for such a meeting. Of course, it's a logical thing, but there's an objection too, isn't there?
It's clear that both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, have concerns about the other. I mean, we're talking about a conflict that's been going on for more than 2 generations. But the only way to overcome this conflict, to try to overcome the barriers and create peace, is for leadership on both sides to show creativity, to show flexibility, and a willingness to overcome those historical barriers. And the only way to do that is through dialogue. And I'd ask the Palestinians, and I think it's a legitimate question, how do you expect to make peace with Israel if you refuse to talk to Israel? With who do you want to make peace?
They would respond, I guess, that all we've said is that the settlements should cease, at least for that time, ideally for more, and the settlements is that crunch issue, and Israel shows no sign of moving on it in any way.
You know, I beg to disagree.
That is your right.
The current Israeli government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has shown more restraint on the settlement issue than any previous Israeli government. We did a 10-month settlement moratorium. And the American administration, who is, as you know, critical of our settlement policies, called Netanyahu's move unprecedented. So we've shown more restraint than any previous Israeli government. We should at least be given credit for that. I can tell you, I've sat in meetings with my Prime Minister with mayors from Jewish communities in the West Bank, and they've literally yelled at my Prime Minister. They say, you're not allowing us to build, you're not allowing us to develop, and it's true. My Prime Minister is only allowing very, very limited construction so as to give peace a chance.
So what ought to happen next? Well, you're saying it should be a dialogue anywhere? A dialogue with an agenda? a dialogue with a time frame? What do you think?
We think that the issues need to be resolved between the highest leadership on both sides. And that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu has invited President Abbas to start ongoing peace talks, ongoing until we find solutions. He once said, using a metaphor, that until white smoke comes out of the chimney. To continue talks until reaching an agreement. Now, we are prepared, in the framework of peace talks, to discuss all the issues that trouble Israelis and Palestinians, all those historic issues that separate us. Nothing is taboo. The Palestinians can bring all their demands to the table. We will bring our concerns. All those tough issues that have eluded solution up until now, that's Jerusalem, settlements, refugees, security, legitimacy. All these tough issues can be on the negotiating table. They'll have to be give and take.
Why is the point of acknowledging that Israel is a Jewish state, which I would say is obvious, it's the Jewish state. Why is acknowledging that fact so important to Mr. Netanyahu?
First of all, just let me say that this is not a precondition for talks.
No,
Israel makes no preconditions. We're ready to start immediately. We think acknowledging Israel's legitimacy is a prerequisite not for starting the process, but for successfully concluding a peace treaty. Just as Israelis, just as my Prime Minister stands up and says, I recognize that there's a Palestinian people that seeks self-determination, a state of their own, we have to hear the same mirror language from the Palestinians, that they say there's a Jewish people entitled to self-determination and a state of its own.
The other thing that I've heard more recently than any other is that the clock is ticking away more dangerously for Israel. Normally one would think Israel has got very, very strong military powers, military equipment, military stuff, but that 50 years from now it will be Israel that will not exist. Do you think that in fact the clock is ticking more dangerously for Israel than for the Palestinians?
I don't know. I really don't know. Israel was established in 1948. We achieved our independence, and since then Israel has been struggling against the odds, against a hostile neighborhood that has refused to accept its legitimacy. And Israel, in many ways, as a country, as a democracy, has flourished. I hope it's possible to achieve peace with our neighbors. And actually the real news over the last few months is what's going on with our neighbors. And you've got this, what has been termed the Arab Spring. And there's a lot of hope in the Arab Spring, because if the Arab Spring brings greater democracy and pluralism and freedom in the Arab world, that ultimately has to be good for peace and reconciliation with Israel. What we are concerned about, while we hope that the Arab Spring produces more positive politics in the Arab world, we are concerned that this opening up of a closed political system has also let loose, unleashed extremist, jingoistic, fundamentalist elements that are not interested not in democracy and of course not in peace with Israel.
And there we have to leave it for this week. As they often say, this story will run and run. Well, alas, this story that we've been covering today will probably run and run and run. Next week we'll still be in America and we'll be joined by Donald Rumsfeld, among others. Do join us then. All the best for now. Bye-bye.